Asserting central dominion, d4 immediately stakes a claim for pawn dominance and opens diagonal pathways for active piece deployment. Developing the knight to a central outpost immediately prepares for kingside expansion and contest over key squares. Establishing central pawn presence and eyeing queenside expansion, this creates immediate spatial pressure. Embracing the fianchetto unlocks diagonal pressure, but risks a slightly cramped kingside. Gaining kingside space, white prepares to fianchetto the bishop, reinforcing the central pawn structure. Embracing the fianchetto, the bishop now surveys the long diagonal, a silent sentinel prepared for future action. Developing the bishop to g2 solidifies the fianchetto, reinforcing control over the long diagonal and preparing for kingside castling. Securing the king is paramount, preparing for eventual central pawn advances and solidifying the pawn structure. Developing the knight to c3 now secures the center and prepares for potential e4 advances, harmonizing with the pawn structure. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to challenge white's central foothold elegantly. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside expansion, this knight gracefully steps into a supportive role, eyeing potential outposts and bolstering the pawn chain's integrity. Solidifying the knight's presence on d7, this maneuver cleverly prepares for a potential kingside pawn push or offers flexible support for the central pawn structure, while importantly, avoiding the immediate tactical complexities that might arise from developing it to f6. Castling here solidifies the king's shelter behind a pawn wall, initiating the classic Kings-Indian defense setup, while simultaneously preparing to connect the rooks for future central action. Black boldly challenges the center, initiating a dynamic pawn struggle that immediately opens lines and demands precise calculation. Asserting central control with this pawn thrust immediately ignites a strategic battle for the d5 square, potentially leading to a more open game with dynamic possibilities for both sides. Solidifying the central pawn structure with this advance prevents white from immediately exploiting the pawn break on e5, aiming to maintain a robust, almost fortress-like setup in the center, and preparing for potential pawn advances later in the game. Bolstering the queenside pawn structure with rb1 prepares for a potential expansion on that wing, aiming to exploit black's slightly cramped position and gain more space for white's pieces to maneuver, potentially creating threats along the b-file and influencing the center indirectly. Laying claim to the b5 square and preventing white's knight from hopping there opens up long-term pawn breaks, but it does concede some queenside space. Pushing the b-pawn here ignites a pawn storm on the queenside, seeking to gain space and potentially disrupt black's developing pieces, but it also creates potential weaknesses and can lead to an unbalanced pawn structure if not handled carefully. Challenging white's central grip head-on, black liberates the d-file and opens lines for their pieces, potentially aiming to exploit any imbalances created by white's pawn advances on the queen side. Reclaiming the central knight solidifies white's pawn structure and prepares to contest the now open d-file, while also preventing black from establishing a strong pawn on d5. Reasserting the central presence after the pawn exchange, black's rook now eyes the open e-file, signaling an intent to challenge white's control of this crucial corridor and potentially support a kingside pawn push later. Securing the kingside pawn structure against potential pawn breaks or piece incursions forms the core of this move, simultaneously creating a safe haven for the king by preventing any back rank infiltration. Shifting the knight to this outpost on e5 immediately stakes a claim in the center and prepares for potential kingside advances, while also eyeing the vulnerable pawn on c4. White is now aiming to support the central pawn push and create a more favorable pawn structure on the queenside by potentially challenging black's knight and preparing for a queenside expansion with moves like c5. Expanding on the queenside, this thrust aims to disrupt white's queenside structure and gain a foothold, potentially opening the queenside for black's pieces. Instantly sharpening the position, this pawn snatch on the queenside seizes the open c-file, promising future pressure against black's castled monarch and potentially opening lines for the rooks. Embracing the pawn chain's disruption, black immediately reclaims central influence and ignites the queenside majority, transforming the pawn structure into a dynamic battleground where flanking activity will soon dominate. The rook's repositioning to the central file immediately prepares for potential breakthroughs and aims to contest control of that open highway, forcing black to consider defensive measures or risk surrendering key territory. The bishop finds a more active diagonal on the queen side, eyeing the d5 square and potentially preparing to contest the b-file, while simultaneously bolstering the kingside defense and offering support for a future NF maneuver if the central pawn structure solidifies. Embracing the initiative, white lunges with f4, aiming to shatter black's carefully constructed pawn shield and pry open the kingside for attacking potential. This aggressive thrust creates immediate tension, forcing black to confront the advancing threat head-on. The move sacrifices a pawn temporarily to gain dynamic play, potentially exposing the black king and disrupting black's piece harmony. It's a bold gambit designed to transition from a positional squeeze to a more direct assault. Unleashing the knight to this outpost suddenly disrupts white's pawn structure and creates a dynamic challenge on the queen side, forcing a reaction and opening new tactical avenues. Shifting the queen to survey the battlefield from d3 offers a commanding perspective, potentially eyeing weak squares or preparing to support a pawn thrust with greater flexibility than from e2, while also being less susceptible to immediate harassment from black's centralized knight. A bold assertion of the open c-file, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and activate the rook to a more central attacking post. A cautious repositioning, kh2* seeks to add a layer of defensive security to the king, anticipating potential tactical jabs and creating a subtle escape square. This move, while seemingly passive, subtly prepares for future pawn pushes or piece maneuvers by removing the king from the immediate path of potential threats along the g-file and diagonal. Black's queen swings over, aiming to bolster the queenside pressure and potentially open lines on the c-file, a subtle but important repositioning to enhance coordination with the bishop on b7. Reclaiming the rook's active post on the third rank aims to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially contest the open c-file, a subtle attempt to steer the game towards a more dynamic endgame where white's central control and knight activity might become more pronounced. Preparing to contest the open c-file with the rook, black subtly repositions for a potential doubling of forces along that crucial vertical, aiming to disrupt white's central control and perhaps create weaknesses around the king. Bringing the rook to the central file, white signals an intent to directly challenge black's pieces and potentially initiate pawn breaks or exchanges that could open lines towards the king. This maneuver isn't just about pawn structure. It's a declaration of active participation in the developing conflict, preparing to contest open or semi-open files and leverage any positional weaknesses that arise from black's somewhat passive development. Black's rook now joins the fray on the open e-file, creating a potential battery with the bishop and aiming to contest this crucial central highway, a sound positional goal given the pawn structure and white's slightly passive king. Reorganizing the knights towards the queen side, this maneuver prepares to contest the open c-file and offers potential support for a pawn push on that flank, while simultaneously clearing the d-file for the rook. Relocating the queen from the active c7 square now seems to surrender valuable counterplay, allowing white's rooks to potentially dominate the open central files and stifling black's hopes of challenging white's kingside pawn structure. Centralizing the knight now addresses the slightly passive placement on e3, aiming to disrupt black's bishop battery and potentially pressure the queenside pawns. Daringly embracing a complex central battle, this knight exchange clears the way for black's rooks to potentially dominate the open files and inject fresh life into their attacking prospects. The immediate relocation of the rook to the third rank unlocks crucial lines for white's major pieces, aiming to pressure black's weakened queenside structure and centralize its forces, preparing for a potential pawn storm or direct assault. Suddenly, a tactical skirmish erupts. Capturing the pawn on e4 injects immediate, raw energy into the position, creating imbalances and forcing white to react decisively. This aggressive thrust disrupts white's carefully constructed central pawn chain and potentially opens lines towards the king. Black has gambled on the immediate tactical advantage, hoping to exploit white's slightly passive knight placement and the open e-file. The entire complexion of the game hinges on how white untangles this sudden mess. Reclaiming central control after the exchange on e4, the bishop now actively pins the rook and aims to disrupt black's coordinated attack. Black recaptures, liberating the bishop and initiating a fascinating positional struggle centered around the open c-file and the potential for queenside counterplay, all while the central pawn structure remains surprisingly solid despite the recent exchanges. Unleashing a queen into the heart of the enemy position, white aims to exploit the compromised pawn structure and weakened king's defense after black's ambitious knight sortie. This bold queenside gamble opens up critical lines and threatens to create chaos, potentially forcing concessions or leading to a swift material gain if black's response is not precise. Reclaiming the initiative, black's rook slides to the 7th rank, eyeing the potentially weak d6 pawn and preparing to contest the open d-file, a crucial pathway for white's queen. Unlocking the diagonal for the bishop, this queenside repositioning seeks to exploit the potential weakness of black's doubled pawns and restrict the opponent's pieces from active squares. Liberating the pinned knight from its defensive post on the d7 square, this maneuver seeks to exploit the newly opened diagonal for the bishop and potentially reactivate the central pawn majority. Shedding the knight from a potentially trapped outpost, white seeks to untangle their pieces and initiate active counterplay, even if it means temporarily sacrificing a pawn to break open the position. The exchange of queens fundamentally alters the character of the position, shifting the focus towards the immense pressure on white's uncastled king, now exposed on the g-file by the removal of crucial defenders. Exploiting the open file with the knight's intrusion into enemy territory promises a significant positional advantage and potential tactical fireworks. Initiating a bold counterattack, this bishop hops into the fray, aiming to disrupt white's newly established central control and forcing a tactical reckoning with the knight on e4.